On a hastily built stage before the busy horse market of Strasbourg, scores of people dance to pipes, drums, and horns. The July sun beats down upon them as they hop from leg to leg, spin in circles, and whoop loudly. From a distance, they might be carnival revelers, but closer inspection reveals something else. Their arms are flailing. Their bodies convulse spasmodically. Ragged clothes and pinched faces are saturated in sweat. Their eyes are glassy, distant. Blood seeps from swollen feet into leather boots and wooden clogs. These are not revelers. These are choreomaniacs, entirely possessed by the compulsion to dance. This was not a festival. This was not a ritual. This was the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, and it was the peak of the most fatal and best documented dancing epidemic in European history. It had all started with one woman, one street, no music. The woman's name was Frau Troffea. On July 14, 1518, she stepped out of her half-timbered home onto a narrow cobbled street and began to dance. There was no music, there was no occasion. As far as the historical record can tell us, she simply began to move, fervently, uncontrollably, without explanation. Her husband pleaded with her to stop. She did not. She danced through the afternoon. She danced until the sky turned black. She collapsed in a twitching heap of exhaustion, and the next morning, she was up again on swollen feet before thirst or hunger could register. By the third day, a crowd had gathered. Hawkers, porters, beggars, pilgrims, priests, nuns, all drinking in the ungodly spectacle. And then something stranger happened. They began to join her. Within days, more than 30 choreomaniacs were in motion, some so monomaniacally that, as one chronicler noted, only death would have the power to intervene. Here is what makes this so difficult to understand from a modern perspective. These people were not dancing because they wanted to. The chronicles describe their movements as spasmodic, arms thrashing violently, bodies drenched in sweat, eyes vacant, expressionless, blood pooling into swollen feet, eventually seeping through leather boots. There were cries for help. If the victims did not succumb to a heart attack, they collapsed from extreme exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Frau Troffea kept dancing for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. At that point, the frightened authorities intervened. They bundled her into a wagon and sent her 30 miles away to Saverne, to the shrine of Saint Vitus, the saint who, it was believed, had cursed her. She was cured, but by then, it was far too late. By August, the dancing plague had seized somewhere between 50 and 400 citizens. The numbers are uncertain. The chronicles disagree. What they do agree on is that the Privy Council of Strasbourg was desperate. The clergy held it to be the work of a vengeful Saint Vitus, divine punishment for sin. But the councillors listened instead to the Guild of Physicians. Their diagnosis? Overheated blood. According to the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine, the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness arose when these humors fell out of balance. The physicians of Strasbourg declared the dancing plague to be, in their words, a natural disease, which comes from overheated blood. And their prescription? The afflicted must dance themselves free of it. This was not a metaphor. The council ordered carpenters and tanners to transform their guild halls into temporary dance floors. They built platforms in the horse market and in the grain market, in full view of the public. They paid dozens of musicians, including drummers, fiddlers, pipers, and horn players, to play continuously. They brought in healthy dancers to encourage the afflicted to keep moving. The authorities were creating what they believed were the optimal conditions for the dance to exhaust itself. It backfired. Horribly. Here is why. Most of the citizens of Strasbourg did not share the physicians' medical view. They saw the dancing as supernatural, a demonstration of the magnitude of Saint Vitus's fury. And none of them being free of sin, many began to believe the safest response was to join in. The epidemic, which the council had tried to cure with more dancing, only spread faster. The Imlan family chronicle records that within a month, 400 citizens had been seized. At the plague's height, as many as 15 people were dying each day. If that figure is accurate, and historians debate whether it is, the final death toll could have reached into the hundreds. The council reversed course. They ordered the stages pulled down. They banned almost all dancing and music in the city until September. This was no small thing for a culture in which communal dancing was central, from upright burghers performing restrained, delicate steps to ale-laden peasants leaping with abandon. The Chancellor of Strasbourg, Sebastian Brandt, carved out one narrow exception. If honorable persons wish to dance at weddings or celebrations of First Mass in their houses, they may do so using stringed instruments, but they are on their conscience not to use tambourines and drums. They believed percussion itself could summon the mania. Then came the ritual. The council ordered those worst afflicted to be bundled into wagons and taken the 3-day ride to the shrine of St. Vitus at Saverne, the same shrine where Frau Troffea had been sent weeks earlier. Vitus was a Sicilian saint martyred in 303 AD. By the late Middle Ages, his name had become attached to a particular belief, that he could punish sinners by compelling them to dance uncontrollably. St. Vitus's dance was already a recognized affliction across the German-speaking world. The ritual was elaborate. Priests placed the choreomaniacs, who were presumably still thrashing about like landed fish, underneath a wooden carving of Vitus. They put small crosses in the dancers' hands. They placed red shoes on their feet. On the soles and tops of these shoes, they sprinkled holy water. They painted crosses of consecrated oil. Incense filled the air. Latin incantations were spoken. And it worked. Word reached Strasbourg that participants had been forgiven by Vitus. More were sent. Within a week or so, the stream of suffering pilgrims had diminished to a trickle. By early September, the dancing plague had ceased. The final death toll is unknown. The contemporary sources from Strasbourg do not mention fatalities. If anyone died, the city did not record it, or chose not to. The dancing plague ended. The questions did not. For 500 years, people have tried to explain what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The explanations have shifted with the centuries, and each one reveals as much about the explainer as it does about the event. The physician and alchemist Paracelsus visited Strasbourg 8 years after the plague. He became fascinated by its causes. His verdict, recorded in his Opus Paramirum, the women were faking it to annoy their husbands. In order to make the deception as perfect as possible, Paracelsus wrote, and really give the impression of illness, she hopped and sang, which was all most distasteful to her husband. He classified this as chorea lasciva, dancing caused by voluptuous desires, without fear or respect. Other women, he concluded, saw the success of the trick and joined in, powered by what he called free, lewd, and impertinent thoughts. Paracelsus deserves some credit. He placed the cause in the minds of the choreomaniacs rather than in heaven. But he revealed more about his own misogyny than about the plague. A more modern theory pointed to ergot, a mind-altering mold that grows on damp rye. Ergot contains ergotamine, a compound structurally related to LSD. It can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and twitching. Ergot poisoning has been implicated in other historical anomalies, including the Salem witch trials. But the historian John Waller, who has written the definitive modern account of the dancing plague, systematically dismantled this theory. Yes, ergot can cause convulsions and hallucinations, but it also restricts blood flow to the extremities. Someone poisoned by ergot simply could not dance for days at a time. Nor would hundreds of people have reacted to the same psychotropic chemicals in exactly the same way. And the ergot theory fails to explain why nearly every dancing plague outbreak in European history occurred along the Rhine and Moselle rivers, areas linked by water, but with quite different climates and crops. The ergot explanation feels satisfying because it is physical, a chemical, a thing we can measure under a microscope, but it does not hold. Waller's explanation requires us to do something more difficult. It requires us to enter the minds of people living in Strasbourg in 1518, not as tourists, not as modern observers, but as they understood their own world. H.C. Erich Mittelfort, the great historian of madness in 16th century Germany, wrote something that Waller quotes at the very beginning of his book. Madnesses of the past are not petrified entities that can be plucked unchanged from their niches and placed under our modern microscopes. They appear, perhaps, more like jellyfish that collapse and dry up when they are removed from the ambient seawater. The ambient seawater of Strasbourg in 1518 was this. A string of bad harvests had produced food shortages. Political instability gripped the region. Disease, including the arrival of syphilis, had induced anguish that was extreme even by the harsh standards of the early modern period. The people of Strasbourg were hungry, frightened, and primed for something to break. And there was precedent. Every European dancing plague between 1374 and 1518 had occurred near Strasbourg, along the western edge of the Holy Roman Empire. The citizens knew what a dancing plague looked like. They believed in the vengeful power of St. Vitus. The cultural script was already written. What happened next, Waller argues, was a phenomenon called psychogenic illness, a mass psychogenic illness to be precise. When extreme psychological stress meets a population that shares a belief system, the mind can produce physical symptoms that are completely real and completely uncontrollable. The dancers of Strasbourg were not faking. They were in a trance state, an altered state of consciousness, in which perception of pain and exhaustion is marginalized. Their bodies moved, their feet bled, their hearts gave out. None of this was voluntary. There is a modern parallel. In 1963, in the newly independent nation of Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, a laughing epidemic broke out at a girls' mission school. It started with a couple of pupils who got the giggles. Within weeks, 2/3 of the students were laughing and crying uncontrollably. The school had to be shut down. The pupils went home and infected their families. Whole villages were consumed by hysterics. Doctors recorded several hundred cases. The epidemic lasted over a year. Same mechanism, different symptom: stress, belief, contagion. To understand what the people of Strasbourg were even doing, you have to let go of the idea that their experience was fundamentally different from experiences the human mind produces today. Trance states, mass psychogenic illness. These things still happen. We have just stopped believing that St. Vitus causes them. None of this makes the people who believed it foolish. The pattern they were tracking was completely real. People were dancing. They could not stop. The physicians observed overheated bodies, which of course they were. Hours of continuous movement heats the blood. The diagnosis was wrong, but the observation was not. And the Curie at the shrine of St. Vitus was not a placebo in the dismissive modern sense. It was a ritual that gave the afflicted permission to stop. It offered a narrative. You were cursed, you have been forgiven, the curse is lifted. The mind, having produced the symptom, could now produce the cure. The dancing plague of 1518 is often called one of history's strangest unexplained events. But that framing is itself a kind of error. It suggests that if we cannot find a pathogen or a poison, we have not really explained it, that the mind is somehow less real than the body. The correction did not erase the evidence. What happened in Strasbourg was not a failure of understanding. It was a collision between a belief system and a set of physical symptoms that belief system made possible. The plague ended when the belief was satisfied, the pilgrimage made, the ritual performed, the saint appeased. That is not a failure of science. It is a demonstration of how powerfully the mind shapes what the body does, and how far we still have to go to understand that relationship. This has been Before the Cure. The dancing plague of 1518 is one of more than 10 such contagions recorded along the Rhine and Moselle rivers between the 14th and 16th centuries. Each one started the same way, with a handful of people who began to move and could not stop. Each one ended the same way, when the community decided it was over. What makes 1518 different is the documentation. Physician notes, cathedral sermons, council records, chronicle entries. We know more about what happened that summer than about any other dancing epidemic in history. And still the central question remains open. How much of what our bodies do is really ours to decide? If you want the next hidden history behind a disease that rewrote what we know about the human mind, subscribe. Do you think mass psychogenic illness explains the dancing plague, or is there something still missing from the story? Share your view in the comments.